There's much diversity between various faith traditions and many differences within each individual tradition. Yet clergy from across the spectrum typically seek to create communities where people who are suffering can feel welcome and cared for. Accomplishing this can be a challenge. Even when a faith community professes its desire to help, people who are struggling may seclude themselves, may be difficult to know how to help, or may have issues that transcend the community's immediate capacities. Additionally, sometimes faith communities, in their desire to help and heal, can unintentionally inflict harm. Knowing how to help persons with mental health problems can present particular challenges. Again, there are no simple answers for how clergy should guide their faith communities in all situations, though there is one approach that is clearly incorrect: silence about mental health issues. We need to create space to talk about disappointments, loss, illness, and suffering. We all experience disappointments and suffering throughout our life, whether or not that suffering leads to and includes diagnosable mental health problems. Beginning from a space of shared humanity and a common sense of vulnerability and interdependency, communities can begin to wrestle with questions of what they do well, what they might not do so well, and where they are capable of making improvements in ministering to the needs of those with emotional and mental health challenges, with a spirit of hospitality and an invitation to belong in a community of fellow travelers.
I'm Father Bill Cantrell. You're viewing the second of two videos encouraging clergy to consider how they and their faith communities can care for those with mental health problems. Our presenters include a psychiatrist, church pastor, congregational care coordinator, imam, church counselor, and rabbi. You will hear about a number of topics related to the care of those with mental health problems, from both clinical and pastoral perspectives. It is our hope that these presentations will further refine your understanding of your role in the context where you serve to assist you in creating and sustaining a welcoming faith community, a place where people carrying the burden of mental health challenges may experience a sense of belonging, a place to call their spiritual home. People of faith, and faith communities in particular, play a crucial role in the health and well-being of our societies. Our voice and witness to our common humanity is needed. How we relate to, care for, and abide with those suffering with mental illness influences the cultural attitudes in our communities and can enhance or diminish support to those who turn to us for care. The wisdom and hope contained in the major faith traditions have endured for centuries, grounding hundreds of millions of people throughout history as they weathered the chances and changes of life. These videos about mental health in no way intend to dismiss or discount the healing, strength, and hope that is found within the various forms of pastoral care. They are rather to encourage a fresh assessment by clergy and faith communities of their understanding of their role as people of faith in providing a loving community where those with mental health problems can belong, without worry of being judged or isolated. A place where they can safely turn to seek help from people who have an understanding and an appreciation about issues related to mental health. The position and authority clergy hold give them a unique opportunity to make a meaningful difference in the lives of those suffering with mental illness. Working together with laity and caring professionals, we can create welcoming communities where mental health issues can be shared and discussed without fear or shame, but rather transformed in love and connection with the divine and the assurance that one belongs.
A lot of times people in faith communities and clergy feel like, I don't have anything helpful to offer to people with mental illness because that's not my training, and they think of it as this is the province of psychology or psychiatry. I think it's important to keep it in perspective that psychiatry, I love being a psychiatrist. I believe that psychiatry has really important wisdom to offer, but modern psychiatry and psychology are about 140 or so years old. Any of our monotheistic faith traditions are at least 10 times older than that. I mean, in my own Christian tradition, we're at least 2,000 years old and significantly more than that if you think of the Jewish context in which we emerged. And throughout that time, people of faith have been walking with each other through the experiences that we would now call mental illness, and there's really helpful lessons to learn there. Two stories that I find really particularly helpful. One is the community of Geel in Belgium, which was a pilgrimage site. There was a terrible story of an Irish princess who fled her father in Ireland in about the 9th century and came to what's now called Belgium and was actually killed by her father there. It's a terrible story of violence. But around that shrine, called the Shrine of St. Dymphna, was her name, became a pilgrimage site where people who had experience that we would now call mental illness would come to be healed. And the little community there called Geel began to take people into their homes and began to live with people. So there started a tradition of people coming for healing at the pilgrimage site who'd be taken in and who'd be integrated into families and into the community. And that persisted from the Middle Ages until really to this day in a slightly different form. Matter of fact, Geel is often looked at as the birthplace of community psychiatric care or community psychiatry. But this emerged as a Christian pilgrimage site, people doing their best to incorporate people and to live with people who showed up among them, the stranger who showed up in town. Another story that I love is the story of a father of the Order of Mercy, a friar of the Order of Mercy called Juan Giliberto Joffre, in the context of 14th and 15th century Spain, which was a place of constant war between the Muslim and Christian armies, and it was a very complicated time. Father Joffre had been involved in ransoming captives who were taken as prisoners of war, and he was due to speak a Lenten sermon, to preach a Lenten sermon at the cathedral in Valencia in 1409. And on his way to the cathedral, walking from his chapter house to the cathedral, he saw a man who we would describe as someone probably with a pretty severe intellectual disability or mental illness or maybe physical disability, but someone who was called un loco by the local people, who was being beaten by a crowd. He was so angry at this that he put himself between the crowd and this man. He told him to stop. He picked up the man and took the man to the chapter house where he'd been staying. And then he marched, probably briskly and angrily, to the cathedral in Valencia. And he told the businessmen of Valencia who were sitting there listening to him, "You all have an obligation not to let this happen in a place like this." And sure enough, a group of business people rose to the challenge and funded an institution that was called the Hospital of the Holy Innocents. I have a colleague, Miguel Romero at University of Notre Dame, who tells this story. It turns out that the Hospital of the Holy Innocents was one of the first, if not the first, psychiatric hospital in Europe that came out of this specifically faith-based context of someone seeing someone vulnerable and beaten on the streets and wanting to create a social situation in which that kind of thing would never happen again. There's all these stories in our own history of whether it's in Christian history or Jewish history or Islamic history, has its own context in these rich intellectual cultures of Cairo and of Persia, of how people of faith have walked with each other. So it's important to learn from psychiatry and psychology, but also to think about the stories that we bear that are much older and much deeper, and their ways of understanding that we bring as people of faith that sometimes actually might inform helpfully the way that modern psychiatric and psychological concepts function.
It's very important for us to embody the gospel as staff people and people who are in leadership and worship. And one of the things that I hope that we all convey is a certain vulnerability that says, this is true for us too. We're broken people. We don't have it all together. This is the way the gospel has been life-changing for us. And we hope that that creates a door where they might consider coming to us where otherwise they might not. There are some people, in spite of our best efforts, who will not think of the church or the pastoral staff or me as senior pastor as the first person, or perhaps they wouldn't come to us at all because they feel like that's too exposing, that somehow we in our office as pastor or church staff represent God in a way that feels threatening. They're intimidated, or they feel like that the truth will out, and that I as the pastor will find out that this person is not as good a Christian as they hope that I think of them as.
Because of society's stigmatizing of mental illness, mental health issues, a lot of people feel that it's a moral failing or something that they're responsible for, and not that it could well be organic, biological, or the result of forces not within their control. And the Talmud itself says that after a lengthy disagreement, it ends with a statement that there is suffering without sin and death without transgression. In the traditional Jewish community, it's, I think, more common for people to feel that there's something wrong here because I've kept the Sabbath, I've kept the holidays, I've kept the laws of keeping kosher, I've done everything I can, the best I can, and I think I've gotten it all right. And that may lead them to curiosity about the organic part of their suffering, or it can lead them to run the other way. And the rabbi needs to be a bridge to say the two aren't related, that God doesn't keep a score sheet and then decide on what illness to give you on the basis of your score sheet.
It is scary coming to a spiritual leader because of the projection that we have of spiritual leaders. You know, they're literally walking on air, they're hanging out with the angels, they're sinless, they're infallible. I feel that opening up a little bit with boundaries with people who come to you about issues that you have gone through really makes a big difference. Clergy should be open if they have received any kind of counseling, even very light counseling, at least something. Being authentic and being open and genuine that, hey, I am vulnerable, to be honest. If I lead with my vulnerability, my openness, then people feel empowered. Permission is being granted. This is a safe space.
I think one of the things that we've tried to do as a congregation, somewhat intentionally in the way that we talk about the gospel, is to create space for people not to feel like they have to have it all together. Because I'm not going to talk to you about the stuff that brings me shame unless I'm convinced that there's room for me, and that's going to provide the context for positive interaction. Theologically, there's some work for clergy to do, to create from the pulpit. We can do great pastoral care from the pulpit that we often can't do in a one-on-one relationship. I can say things to my congregation that I would never say to you if you were sitting there across the room from me. So I think I have a certain obligation as a pastor to be thinking therapeutically, if you will, about my congregation and what kind of space I'm creating. I think that's very important in an overall goal of creating an environment for people to believe that God might not disavow them in their shame.
Clergy are the bearers of their traditions. That's going to be different, of course, according to what the tradition is and how the particular congregation fits into the tradition as a whole. But people are going to see clergy as in some ways the authoritative spokespersons of whatever the tradition is, whether it's Christianity or Judaism or Islam. That functions differently in different faith contexts. But a lot's going to be projected onto that image, especially among those who may not know the clergy person really well. So there's assumptions made about what the clergy person believes, about how the clergy person acts, that may or may not be helpful. So I think that can be a challenge, and especially people who feel deep shame because of feelings like they're not measuring up, like they're not good enough in what they're doing, like they've made really bad choices or bad mistakes, are sometimes going to find that speaking to a clergy person is going to be a little hard because they're concerned about being immediately judged. Shame is the emotion that tells us as human beings that we really don't belong or that we're not worthy. Shame always premises some thought that has to do with I am not blank enough. That could be I'm not good enough, I'm not holy enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not well-versed enough, I don't know the Bible enough, I'm not socially aware enough, and that result of shame is that I don't belong here. And the natural result of shame, if you think about the facial expression of shame, it's always downcast eyes and retreat. So shame, when we feel it, pulls us away from others. Unfortunately, what sometimes happens within faith communities is that we talk about holiness, we talk about purity, we talk about living right, we talk about obedience, and so there's a premium put on people who have it together. And so someone who doesn't feel like they have it together at that moment, who doesn't feel like they want to play that game, who maybe is furious about social pretense and doesn't want to have to even pretend like things are going well, then the tendency is just to retreat. And so it creates this vicious cycle where shame gives rise to isolation and alienation, which then intensifies aloneness and feelings of not belonging, which intensifies isolation, which intensifies aloneness, until before long, as a result of shame, people might be participating in a community, but not really. They're showing up and then leaving and not ever really disclosing themselves. Or they might just drop out of a community altogether. So without saying that shame could never have any kind of positive effect in human life, we have to be attentive to this. And religious communities have a deep obligation, I think, to speak to each other without primarily motivating each other by shame. And whenever we as humans can talk about things that are deeply private, maybe of which we're ashamed or fearful, and are known by another, and that doesn't send us away or send other people away, but it invites us into community, that creates all sorts of really constructive opportunities for everything else. So once that initial conversation has happened, this happened once and I did this, or I have an ongoing habit of doing a certain thing that I don't know what to do and I don't know how to control and I don't know how to stop, then that creates then all sorts of possibilities of a community gathering together to think, what does it mean to seek healing here? What does it mean to seek wholeness here? What does it mean to make sense of this together? And so if that's a shared journey of discovery between the pastor and between someone that they're counseling, that can be more helpful than the person feeling like I'm coming before a judge who's going to then render judgment about me right now. I think often a relationship that helps to overcome shame can help pave the way for more helpful forms of reconciliation, of confession, of forgiveness, of the ability to go on in community. But it starts, I think, with deeply seeking to understand where someone else is coming from and what their experiences are and what's behind it. And the result of that, when it's done well and when it's done in healthy ways, is freedom, is relief, is a feeling of being known and being loved. And then from that, the ability to go forward in new and constructive ways.
I do believe the resistance for people, even at the pastor's encouragement to see me as a mental health clinician, is they feel there is a perception of them as not being spiritual enough, not having enough faith. What I have found specifically as it relates to African Americans is not being strong enough. You're supposed to come from a strong line of people who have had to overcome such adversity that you should be able to just overcome adversity without any assistance, if you will.
Now, with the community perspective, if someone has a mental health issue, for them to go to a secular psychotherapist or mental health professional, there is a strong fear that they'll be labeled as being crazy. You could be a member of the community, for example, that's an accountant or a lawyer or a doctor. And this professional could fear that if I went and saw a mental health professional, number one, that I'll be labeled as crazy in the community. And number two, this could affect my livelihood, because members of the community could see, oh, well, this lawyer is going to a mental health professional. He or she must be crazy, so I can't really trust his or her acumen and stability and mental stability and work ethic and so on and so forth. So it's a community shame, also financial risk as well.
There can still be messages that come from the pulpit that can hinder people from seeking out my services. I have had many a client to come and sit with me and will discuss their reluctance in coming, their calling and hanging up, their leaving a message and not showing up for the scheduled appointments would be a result of hearing from the pulpit, you shouldn't be stressed because you're blessed. Again, with that thought that perhaps I should be more faithful, or if I pray more, if I were more spiritual, if I attended church more, that would help me deal with whatever this is I'm dealing with, and therefore I don't need to seek out mental health services.
I do think in the very nature of conversation about the intersection between human beings and God, there are certain pressures that people experience that work against honest description of problems and difficulties. So, for example, if someone is reading a particular text from the New Testament that says, "Rejoice always, give thanks in all circumstances," what does that person do with the fact that they barely could get out of bed that morning? What does that person do with the fact that there is nothing joyful about their life circumstances at that particular moment? I think there are certain Christian traditions that would approach that in such a way as to say, well, you just need to confess it, rejoice even though you don't feel like it, and you'll get better. You'll get yourself, kind of work yourself to a place of rejoicing. Where that gets more complicated is when you layer that with a sense of divine calling, like God wants you to be happy, that actually short circuits some deeper issues that might need to be addressed, either in the pastor's study or in a therapeutic relationship.
At the New York Jewish Healing Center, we have a monthly group for those who have survived a close one's suicide. And there was a suicide of a young adult from a very traditional Jewish community, and this rabbi kind of reluctantly spoke with me and said that he had instructed the family not to say a word about how the daughter died. Now, members of the family came to see me because they wanted to come to the group, and certainly there they would have to share something. And they wondered in general whether the rabbi was right about his teaching from Leviticus 10. In Leviticus 10, Aaron, Moses' brother, suddenly loses his two sons who are consumed in a fire because of something wrong. It's very unclear what they did. And it says that Aaron was deeply silent. The Hebrew word used, vayidom, means deeply silent. So this rabbi had shared with them that that means he accepted what happened to him and that he acquiesced in God's judgment. And this family knew that something was wrong with that. And so in the group, people said, well, I think it means he was muted, he was dumbfounded, he had no words for what happened. And they came to accept that too. And a member of the family, a sibling, came regularly for a couple of years. So there are times when theology, or more, to be accurate, it's more culture. It's more about culture than theology can get in the way.
A pastor's understanding of what it means to be human really matters here. And for some pastors, it's easy to be a Gnostic, just treat the spiritual world as if that's the only important world, as opposed to seeing the human being in front of you in all of his or her glory and despair. Material and physical and spiritual and emotional, it all goes together. There might be real reasons. When I'm talking with somebody who has depression, the first question I always ask is the physiological one. When was the last time you saw a doctor? Are you getting any exercise? Tell me about your sleep patterns. Now, on the surface, none of those things have, quote, spiritual ramifications. But in my mind, they all go into the total picture of who this person is.
Clergy are perceived by many to hold the sacred obligation of modeling right living, authenticity, integrity, and truth. Sometimes a willingness to show our own dependence, vulnerability, brokenness, and need for community can be helpful. Most, if not all of us, have known about our own weaknesses since before our answer to the call of ordained ministry. And we have also discovered the richness, wisdom, and grace in our faith traditions, which have been redeeming. When appropriate, our willingness to share these truths from a personal perspective can be of great benefit to those we serve. Healthy discussion within our faith communities about mental health issues can help diminish explicit and implicit shaming and contribute to creating a safe and welcoming place for people to bring their whole selves, perhaps the only place they can go where they can be fully accepted.
Mental health challenges are challenges that affect the whole person. We live in our culture in the shadow of a philosopher named René Descartes, who lived from 1596 to 1650 and is considered the father of modern philosophy. Descartes had this idea, and he had theological reasons for wanting to think this, but he had this idea that humans had bodies that were fundamentally a matter of matter and extension in space. And within those bodies, there were souls, that we were bodies who had souls, or souls who inhabited bodies. Descartes believed that he himself was a thinking being, that the essence of who he was as a thinking being, as a soul or as a mind, and that he inhabited a material body. That's given us this long-standing belief that's deeply entrenched in our culture and in our ways of thinking, that we exist as these dualities of body and mind that have to interact in some way. Now, there's a couple of ways in which this shows up in our current ways of thinking about mental health. One way of thinking sometimes is that mental illness or mental health challenges exist in the mind or in the soul and not in the body. So the kinds of responses that come to that is like you just need prayer, or you just need to change your way of thinking, but not affecting what's happening on the level of your body. And in fact, mental health challenges like depression and anxiety, and certainly like psychotic disorders or mood disorders like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, don't just happen in the mind, they also are happening in the body, including in the deepest ways in the level of neurotransmitters and biochemistry and brain receptor systems. And so treatment needs to be not only thinking about what's happening in the through what we call the psychological or spiritual realms, but also what's happening on the level of the body. How is someone sleeping? How is someone eating? Is someone getting exercise? Is someone taking care of their body? And then sometimes medications are necessary, I think, for certain conditions for the body. There's another way in which Descartes' thought can get interpreted, and that's actually not saying that mental health challenges are happening in the mind and not in the body, but it's that they're saying they're happening only in the body. So you get mantras like mental disorders or brain disorders, or mental illness is just a matter of a broken brain. That also isn't very helpful for us in thinking about humans as whole person beings, because it's true, it's absolutely true that mental illness does happen in the body. It happens in the brain. But it doesn't happen only in the body. It also happens in the fullness of who we are as human beings. It happens as our bodies engage with other bodies in relationships. It happens as we inhabit cultures that send us certain kinds of messages. It happens as we relate to God. So almost every mental health challenge is not just happening in the body, but it's happening in the body as our bodies live in the world, as we engage with other bodies, as we live before God and before each other. So we are biosocial beings. We're whole, full person beings. And in fact, the tradition in which I come, Christian tradition, has always taught not that humans are these dualities of body and soul, but rather that we're embodied souls or ensouled bodies. The way I think of it is that we're bodies on the way to God. We're wayfarers who are on a journey, and we're wayfarers as body and soul. So in that way, everything about our lives at all times, because we are wayfarers on the way to God, is in some way has to do with the spiritual life, because the spiritual life is nothing more than to think of our lives as it relates to our journey to God. But to say that something is a spiritual challenge doesn't mean that it's not also at the same time a biological, psychological, social challenge, because we're always integrated beings at all times. And so in every case, thinking about what is it that is necessary for this person on a journey, what's going to be helpful for the journey is the way that we should be thinking. Sometimes what we might consider these more holistic interventions like prayer or like just being part of a community or Bible study can be all that's necessary. But sometimes the most basic forms of biological intervention like medication can be necessary. So when someone says, "Oh, I'm depressed because I'm not praying enough, or I'm not studying the Bible enough, or or I've got unconfessed sin in my life," that all may be true, but it doesn't mean that it's only a spiritual issue and not at the same time an issue that can benefit from the kind of support that counselors and therapists can provide, and maybe even than doctors and psychiatrists can provide. Where I think faith community leaders can be very helpful is specifically interpreting those aspects of life that do relate to God. A lot of clinicians, especially those that aren't formed within religious traditions, but even those that are, will often be very reluctant to talk with somebody about anything that might relate to sin or to religious norms or expectations. But a priest or a clergy person or an imam or a rabbi is the mediator of that tradition and can speak meaningfully from the tradition about what does it mean to be reconciled to God and to each other, and how can that happen helpfully. So clergy can be deeply helpful in that regard. What clergy have to be aware of, and most clergy I think are, especially those that have significant experience in ministry, is not to present any mental health challenges as an easy fix. People will interpret pastors and other faith leaders as saying things like, you just need to get your heart right, or you just need to pray more, or you just need to read scripture more, in part because a lot of people have heard that over the course of their lives when they've gone through challenges. And so pastors who say that can sometimes create a situation where it's not safe to talk about pain and vulnerability and significant challenges that go along with mental health or mental illness. But what pastors can do, hopefully not alone, but hopefully in creating a culture of a community, is to send other kinds of messages like, we will walk with you no matter what. You're part of us, and you belong to us, and we to you. We'll walk with you not only by praying for you, but by coming and visiting you, or by calling you, or by sending you emails occasionally, just saying, "Hey, just want you to know that we're thinking of you and praying for you today." Maybe sometimes, in some cases, meals are helpful, or certain kinds of company is helpful. It all depends on what's happening in the individual's life.
I believe that some myths the faith community may hold about mental illness that need to be acknowledged, addressed, and dispelled in order for the faith community to more effectively minister to and embrace those who are dealing with mental health issues, might be that they're not crazy. They are struggling from, in some cases, a real disorder, just as anyone would be with heart disease or cancer or diabetes. These are real disorders that people are struggling with. These people struggle just as much as the person who deals with the nausea coming from chemotherapy treatments. That's a myth that could be dispelled, as well as thinking that it might be a result of a sin issue. It's not always an issue of sin. Faith community can understand that there are some disorders that, again, are biological in nature. Brain chemistry might be off. Parts of the brain may be impacted either through injury or illness that can create some behavioral disturbances that people may again view through a spiritual or a sin lens. So I do believe that if we understand as a faith community that there are some legitimate causes for some of the mental health disorders that people experience that are not necessarily sin-related, it would give us a different understanding and a different approach as we reach out to and create this environment for people not to feel alienated or ostracized based on what it is that they are experiencing.
I feel that there is a spiritual distortion in the framework in our worldview of perceiving mental health and that connection with God. In that if someone has anxiety or has depression, then they have lost their trust or reliance, tawakkul is the word in Arabic, with God, right? And if they were more patient, if they had more, the word in Arabic is sabr, if they had more patience and had more reliance on God, they wouldn't be anxious because everything is going to be in God's hands. They wouldn't be depressed because that anger wouldn't really be there. They'd be hopeful in the future of God's reward in the next life and God's paradise. And what we try to reframe from a chaplain's perspective is that when somebody is sick with a physical illness, do we have the same worldview? Why is there a double standard between the two types of wellness, mental and physical? Meaning that if I played a sport and I sprained my leg, then I'm taking medicine, I'm doing rehab. Is this a punishment from God? Is it a trial? Is it my lack of faith? Or is it that I need to get my health taken care of? We as chaplains need to understand our religious framework, and then how can we explain that to members of our communities that, look, it's a type of illness just like hurting your arm is, playing a sport or injured at work or whatever it may be. So I believe mental health is part of the body. Right? Your brain and all these functions are part of the body. And as a Muslim, we are entrusted, and amana in Arabic, to take care of our body.
I believe that the myths people have about what happens in therapy also need to be acknowledged. I've heard specifically from family members that they don't want to go or send their loved ones for counseling because they are afraid that they will be brainwashed. That's not what therapy is about. That's not what therapy involves. As well as it relates to the faith community, that we stand in direct opposition to what is taught spiritually. We do not. A good therapist takes the resources that the individual brings in, and that's whatever their faith community is, whatever their faith practices may be, and we help them to see how to integrate those into their lives to help, again, cope or deal with whatever the mental health disorder is that they might be struggling with. I believe clergy, if they are able to create a more systemic atmosphere where mental health issues are presented, talked about, accepted, embraced as readily as Breast Cancer Support Month, Health Month is now. If the entire faith community supports Mental Health Awareness Month, they talk about it. They sponsor such days as National Depression Screening Day, or if they even host an initiative to say, we are providing mental health professionals on site to come and help you determine if there is depression or anxiety or some other mental disorder, and here are some resources that you can utilize to begin this process of healing those mental health disorders. I do believe that that is an approach that the faith community can take to create this environment where we're saying, hey, there's a place here for you. We understand these things exist. We talk about them here. We don't shun away from them. We welcome you in. We understand there are some days you may not feel well. We understand there are some days you may not feel you're behaving in a manageable way, but we're going to come and we're going to love you anyway. I do believe that that creates an atmosphere where people feel more safe, they feel less guilty, they feel less shame about seeking out mental health services.
When I look at a bird's eye view of the American Jewish community, I think we're only at the beginning of the collaborations between mental health professionals and clergy. There's some wonderful things going on where I work. We have spiritual support groups for chronic illness, for bereavement of all kinds, and for trauma that are co-led by a rabbi and a mental health professional. The reason being that we want it to be holistic, and we also want it to flow easily between issues that you might label as psychosocial and those that are spiritual or religious. And as well, for Jewish holidays, we have bereavement programs. That is, for example, during Hanukkah, one of the nights of Hanukkah, there's a candle lighting strictly for bereaved Jews called Lights in the Darkness. And before Passover, we have a workshop called Coping with the Empty Chair at the Seder. And all of these the motivation is really to not make a thick line between mental health and religion and spirituality. In my rabbinical school class, I have an assignment in the middle of the semester where they have to come up with posters to put up in synagogues or in the school that begin to normalize and increase the dialogue about behavioral health issues. So one student came up with one related to Passover. Before the Passover holiday, Jews clean their homes. They have to get out every crumb of leaven, and then they switch to different dishes. It's quite the opportunity for the obsessive compulsive Jew to go off the deep end. And so one student, and the word for the leaven is chametz. So one student did a poster that said, "Chametz is not dirt," in big letters, and that said, "If you or someone you know suffers from OCD," and it gave a number to call for support. And they did this for alcoholism and for all kinds of mental health diagnoses. And the idea was that was one intervention that will just get it up on the walls, and kids will ask, "What is this?" and they can hear about it and they can talk about it in class. And then we believe it's really important for first-person narratives, which can be anonymous, to appear in the synagogue's online bulletin. I confronted this, and I suffered in this way, I got this help, and now I'm here. And of course, rabbis need to work it into sermons. There's now a lot of material being prepared for different parts of the Jewish year to relate different holidays to different issues. Or we have this weekly reading of the Torah, 3 or 5 chapters from the 5 books of Moses, and it triggers all kinds of themes, especially Genesis and some stories later, themes about families and illness. So I think it needs to be woven into the whole life of the community so that there's a freeing up of the dialogue.
You've heard our presenters speak to the health of a whole person, including concerns of body, mind, and spirit. So what does it mean to be a whole person who is struggling? In your faith tradition, how do you understand the theological explanations and responses to suffering? What are potential stumbling blocks related to blame and guilt, or opportunities for redemptive conversations related to suffering? Our primary goal here is not to define the right way of believing, thinking, or responding in care, but rather to honor the richness in our faith traditions, acknowledge the powerful influence that they can have to bring healing to those who suffer, and to encourage your fresh consideration of the role that you have in caring for those with mental health problems. What are your resources, and how well are you doing in creating and sustaining a welcoming community where those who suffer can call it their spiritual home?
One way to make it safe for people to talk about mental health challenges in congregations is to start talking about mental health challenges within congregations. And there's lots of ways to do that. And for the most part, any effort to do that in an open and an open-ended way is going to be helpful. A lot of people tell me that they've lived in church with depression for many years, And no one in their faith community has ever talked about depression from the pulpit or in a worship service, or there's never been a program specifically that addresses it. So people get that message. If it's not ever talked about by people who are in authority, then maybe it's not safe to talk about in other contexts either. But that's an easy thing to address. So pastors might mention depression in a sermon, might tell a story of someone that they've helped, or sometimes if they're comfortable even themselves negotiating a certain mental health challenge. There could also be programs that don't have to be very complicated. I have a colleague and friend who in his congregation, which is a larger congregation in a community near here, about 25 years ago, started a support ministry for people with bipolar disorder. So for the last 25 or so years, every Tuesday night, they open up the church building, and there is a local community that begins to meet, and they talk about mental health challenges. It's mostly a community of support, and then they leave. And they've done that every week for about 25 years, and in that time, over 1,500 people have come through that group. And it's created a culture within the church and also within the broader community that it's okay to talk about these questions and these challenges. There's another local congregation here that is in a university town, and noted that there's a lot of folks not only associated with the university, but also in the community, including folks that are economically very disfranchised or homeless who struggle with mental health challenges. And yet the church wasn't talking about it enough. So in the recent Lenten season, they actually had a mental health Stations of the Cross, which is a Christian tradition around Lent and the Passion and the Holy Week, and they actually had stations where people could meditate on Jesus' own passion and death, but to do so in the context of thinking also about present mental health challenges of people in the congregation and in the local community. It was creative, but not that complicated to put together. It was a matter of a congregation deciding to do that. Another congregation that I'm aware of that's in a rural area in North Carolina found itself surrounded by a large community of refugees from Southeast Asia. And remarkably, the folks within this community began to see the church as a local place of belonging and of support, began to come to the church and see the church as a site of community. And that's been a really wonderful, transformative thing for this small rural church in eastern North Carolina. One of the things that they've noticed is that within this refugee community, with people that have often lived for many years in refugee camps and have witnessed or their parents have witnessed significant political violence and displacement, there's lots of issues of trauma. There's alcohol use that gets carried over and affects families and communities. So the small congregation has begun thinking about how can we respond helpfully? So they've just begun talking about that, talking about alcohol and talking about trauma. And what they found is that you don't start with the heavy-duty clinical stuff. You talk about what is it like to live with stress? What is it like to live with challenges? What is it like to live in a new place? And that those kinds of conversations can allow people then to talk about those places of vulnerability, which is really, really remarkable.
We trust that the different voices you have heard in this video have stimulated some thoughts with respect to your ministry and faith communities. As you look to improve the care that you and your community provide to those with mental health challenges, we encourage you to consider the following issues. Does your faith community make space for those with mental health problems, and what does that look like when done well? Identifying strengths of your community can be a good place to start, while recognizing that not all persons are going to fit the same mold. Are there aspects of your faith community that may cause persons suffering from mental health problems to turn away? If so, what are these? Why do they exist? Are they malleable? What theological as well as practical resources might you build upon to strengthen your community's ability to abide with those who live with emotional and mental health challenges? Faith traditions have long histories and rich depths from which to build thoughtful, faithfully consistent practices of meaningful care. I encourage you to explore yours.